Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, we're talking once again about Thor. You can never talk too much about Thor. So some of you might know, the dozen of you who saw the video where I was talking about this, some of you might know that I am doing a project where I'm reading every issue of Thor up until the mid-90s, the original series of Thor. Thor, the original series, was canceled in 95 or 96 and eventually came back with the #1 issue. But I am reading everything from 62? Yeah, it was 1962. Everything from 1962 all the way up to the mid-90s, 95 or 96. And Thor issue, was it 502 or 503? One of those issues. But I'm reading everything from that initial run of Thor. And I just finished this first epic collection, which has Thor's initial appearances. He originally appeared in a comic book called Journey into Mystery. He was just one story in the comic book, Journey into Mystery. He was a regular feature in that comic book. Eventually, he became so popular that the comic book Journey into Mystery became Thor. And these original issues of Thor, it took a little while for Thor to kind of find himself as a comic book character. Originally, the first Thor story was really interesting in a lot of ways. It had great artwork, but Jack Kirby didn't stay on the book, and Stan Lee didn't stay on the book either. They were both replaced by another artist, and Stan Lee's brother, Larry Lieber, scripted the comic for a while. And those initial stories were not great. They weren't terrible. Well, there was one story that was pretty terrible, but they weren't great, they weren't terrible, they were just like, they were nothing special. They felt actually like something you might read at DC Comics. Steve is not going to like me saying that. But it just had that kind of basic Silver Age feel. Thor was an interesting character, though. And we have this character. And Dr. Donald Blake, the lame Dr. Donald Blake, he's lame in more ways than one. Although in this comic book, they're referring to the fact that he's got a bum leg. Anyway, he's on vacation in Norway. He goes into a cave, he finds a stick, he bangs this stick on the ground, and boom, he becomes Thor. He becomes Thor. He becomes this guy. This is the first splash page of Thor, the first illustration you'll find in the comic book of Thor, and it's a wonderful, wonderful illustration. I mean, Thor looked great from the very beginning. Really cool character design, and it was fun. This first issue was fun. Now, the most mysterious thing, though, about Thor in Journey into Mystery was Dr. Donald Blake himself, because he doesn't just get the power of Thor, which he does, because when he picks up this hammer, Mjolnir, is it called Mjolnir? I think it's Mjolnir. Anyway, on the hammer itself is written in handy English, "Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." But as we learn, he doesn't just possess the power of Thor. He becomes Thor, like the original Thunder God. And we find this out rather quickly because other Asgardians start showing up in this comic book, starting with Loki. Let me see if I could find that issue with Loki. Yeah, Loki shows up. Thor's terrible brother, Loki. So Loki, the god of mischief, shows up, and then we start seeing Asgard and the Rainbow Bridge. We see Odin. Odin shows up to talk to Thor and to help Thor out once in a while. And so it turns out, hey, Thor has this whole history. Now, originally, what I think Stan Lee was thinking is that he was thinking he was going to have a character that was kind of like Captain Marvel. Not the new Captain Marvel, but the old original Captain Marvel. And the original Captain Marvel was a little kid named Billy Batson. He met the wizard Shazam. Shazam said, hey, say my name, and a lightning bolt will come down, and you'll become a whole other guy. You'll become an adult superhero. And that's what happened. Billy Batson would say Shazam. Boom, he's transformed into a whole other person. He was transformed into Captain Marvel, who we now know as Shazam, I think. I think that's how it's working now, due to legal rights stuff. Marvel Comics took over the name Captain Marvel, obviously. But Stan Lee was kind of using that Shazam Captain Marvel thing, where you would have this guy, Dr. Donald Blake, who's this weakling with a bad leg, but he hits that cane on the ground and boom, he becomes a whole other guy. He becomes Thor. And that's the mysterious part, because they share memories. Thor is in love with the same woman that Dr. Donald Blake is. It becomes obvious that they're the same person, they're just inhabiting two different bodies. At least it seems that way. But that doesn't make any sense, because Donald Blake lived a whole other life before he found this stick. And Thor lived a whole other life that, existed hundreds of years before Dr. Donald Blake did. So what's the deal with Dr. Donald Blake? It was almost mysterious. Of course, this mystery was eventually solved. I won't spoil it for you because it was very strange. If you want to do what I'm doing and just start reading at the beginning. But from what I remember, it is resolved, and the whole Dr. Donald Blake thing takes a weird turn, from what I remember. But when you were reading this in 1962 and 63, it must have been weird. You must have been asking that question. But you probably didn't care too much, because eventually this really cool thing happened. There was a backup feature that showed up in this comic book, and it was called Tales of Asgard. Let's see if I could find the first issue with Tales of Asgard in it. I will find it here any moment now. Any moment I'll find Tales of Asgard. Here it is. It originally showed up in this issue, Journey into Mystery 97, where Thor battles the Lava Man. It wasn't bad. It was not a bad story. And at the end of this issue, we have a backup feature, Tales of Asgard. And what happens here is we start getting the backstory of Asgard and Odin and all of these other characters from Norse mythology. And Stan Lee, very loosely, adapts some stories and some stories about characters from Norse mythology into this backup feature. And it's tremendously interesting. And the artwork is great Jack Kirby stuff. I mean, he just cuts loose in this series. This series had a bigger panel design on the page. Normally in Thor comics, you had a smaller panels, where you'd have like 6 or 7 panels usually to a page. In Tales of Asgard, you usually had 4. So you had bigger illustrations that could tell a more epic story. And then we've got Suitor, the fire demon, who just keeps coming back and causing trouble for years and years and years on Thor. In the first story, we get the beginning of humankind. We see humans first appear, at least the Asgardian version. And then we have Odin battles Ymir, the king of the ice giants, in the second story. And look at that. Whenever I see this drawing by Jack Kirby, it makes me wish that Jack Kirby had done an issue or two of Conan the Barbarian. I mean, how awesome would that have been if Jack Kirby had drawn some Conan? He would have been good, judging from this, because he's excellent with this fantasy stuff. So we're getting all these cool stories from Norse mythology. And while that's happening, we start seeing more of Asgard and Asgardian characters in Thor. Because this series of stories becomes very popular very quickly. There was probably not too much else like this out on the comic book stands at this time. And then we get the boyhood of Thor. We get some stories about Thor when he was a little kid and as a teenager. Here he battles giants, and he's trying to pick up the hammer that he knows eventually will be his when he becomes worthy. He just has to accomplish a bunch of mighty, noble deeds before he can do it. He's picking it up a little bit at a time. He picks it up a little bit more after every, mighty adventure where he proves his worth. And then we have the invasion of Asgard. Again, we have Thor as a little kid. And eventually, we have Thor as an 18-year-old in Death Comes to Thor, where Thor faces death herself and is willing to sacrifice himself for the innocent Sif. And for that, he becomes worthy enough to handle his hammer, and there he is lifting his hammer for the first time. Cool stuff. But there was all kinds of stuff, like when Heimdall failed. You get all these stories about the other characters that lived in Asgard, and the other gods and goddesses, and magicians and sorcerers and sorceresses, and all kinds of other cool stuff. So this was really popular. And like I said, we started to get more and more of Asgard in the main feature of Thor. And around this same time, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby both came back to this book. And this book really needed them, because the fill-in artists, or the artists that were on the book in the time that they were gone, were not particularly great for Thor. Yeah. This book really needed Jack Kirby, and it got Jack Kirby back. And so we started to get some just really cool Thor stories that started featuring, all these Asgardian characters. Like this one, Giants Walk the Earth, where there's a tremendous battle on Earth with Asgardians. We've got Odin and Balder the Brave and Thor, and there's Surtur the fire demon. I mean, it was awesome. And there's Loki. That's just such a cool drawing of Loki. I mean, that's just him right there. And you started getting this just amazing epic feel to this comic book. It started being different. This was a different comic book. It had a different feeling. It felt like more of a fantasy story than your average superhero comic book. And where a lot of superhero comic books, you have human beings with seemingly godlike powers. In this, you actually got a god. You had the real deal. You had Thor, god of thunder. And eventually, you started getting some Greek gods as well. Like in this second volume, you actually get Hercules. Let's see if I could find Hercules. I'm looking for him, so of course it'll take a minute for me to find him. Where are you? Oh, this isn't Hercules, but look at that cover. I mean, you started getting stuff like that. I mean, can you imagine in the mid-60s finding a cover like this? I mean, that's just incredible. I mean, just some great stuff started happening on this book. And here we go. Here's what I was looking for. Hercules. And so we actually get the Greek gods, and we get Hercules to battle Thor. Now, who in the world wouldn't want to see Hercules battle Thor? I mean, that's awesome. That's awesome. And yeah, and we still get all kinds of other cool stuff. I think we've got this wonderful illustration of Asgard there. I mean, that's just incredible. I really think that this comic book, these early issues of Thor, once Stan Lee and Jack Kirby really hit their stride, this comic book could be Stan Lee and Jack Kirby at their best as a team. Fantastic Four was pretty great too. But there's just something so creative and fun and different about this. I don't know. They're neck and neck in my estimation. Fantastic Four and Thor. But it was that backup feature, I think, Tales of Asgard, that really helped transform the Thor comic book into what it became. Because before that, it did have the feeling of just being, you know, kind of an average superhero comic book that wasn't, except for the fact that you did have a god, it wasn't so different from a lot of other comics. And some of them were just straight bad. Like this Thor trapped by the carbon copy man could be the worst Thor story of all time. So it had some rough patches at the beginning, but it really didn't take long for it to really hit its stride. And it did so, you know, in the second half of this Epic collection, it started getting really good. And so that when you get to this stuff in 1964 to 1966, I mean, you've got Thor, you've got the comic that we all came to know and love, those of us who love Thor. So there you go. I guess I've talked long enough about Thor and Tales of Asgard. Go check out Steve Donoghue and see what he has to say about all this. I will catch you next time.